Welcome to Community Connection. I'm your host, Martha Constantinides. Today we have a special program where we'll be discussing the topic of food insecurity amongst first-generation college women. We're joined by author and expert Dr. Roi Armstrong, who wrote the book First-Generation College Students, Starving to Matter, which can be bought at all common retailers. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So as you know, there have been food insecurity among college students has been a topic of discussion in higher education systems for a while now. Can you just explain a little bit why you decided to hone in on this topic?
Sure. So, having been a college student myself a couple different times, I remember teetering on the verge of food insecurity in my undergrad years, and I had several friends who were actually food insecure themselves. So that was always a topic near and dear to my heart, and I would have them over for lunch or dinners and try to help them in any way that I can if I felt like my friends were really struggling. So I was already primed to notice that. And then after I got my master's, I started teaching at various colleges and universities in Massachusetts. And I would hear my students talk before and after class about the choices they were making, the difficult challenges they faced with money, books, tuition, buying clothing, working a full-time job, and then also going to school, and how food seemed to fall off the list when it came to making choices. So I was hoping that things had improved, since I was younger in my undergrad days, and they have, because there's been more resources toward it, but because tuition prices have risen at a pace that hasn't followed with people's economic levels, their pay increases, and there has been a reduction in federal aid for students. So it's sort of like forming the perfect storm of basic needs and securities, unfortunately. So as a professor, I thought to myself, well, how can I help? So I worked with student affairs and found out about some resources that were available. And that led me to want to take an even deeper dive, because although the public and private colleges and universities where I taught, resources were available, they were sparsely used. So I said to myself, what is it that's getting in the way? And so that's how I started down this road of research.
Absolutely. So can you go into a little bit more? So you mentioned that you were a professor.
Yes.
So is there a significant difference between first generation college students and other college students that you've seen with food insecurity as well?
Sure. Yes. So when I started researching the topic, I was looking at all students. Like, I wasn't breaking it down by gender or, first gen, non-first gen, or anything else. So when I started looking at the research, I noticed that most of it was quantitative. So it was surveys, because that's the easiest way to get people to talk about a difficult topic like that anonymously, right? So it was all surveys. And I noticed that in all the surveys, women were self-reporting more food insecurity than men. So I thought, well, that's okay, that's interesting. So then I started talking to some of the students on campus, and then I started doing more research, and there was a gap, right, between what I saw happening on college campuses and what was being talked about in the academic circles. So I thought to myself, okay, there's something here. So I did a little more deeper dive, and there were articles about it, and they were sort of like tucked into these articles were little phrases like, okay, underrepresented students, students of color, first gen students were really self-reporting with food insecurity. So I thought, okay, so I'm on to something. So what happens, and what in my research and the people I talk to, staff and faculty and everything, is that first gen students tend to be the first, obviously, in their families to go to college. When you are the first of anyone to do anything, right? There's a framework that hasn't been completely built. So they know enough to know that college is where they want to be, but they don't have, like, for example, they don't know how to speak college. So people whose parents went to college, they know what office hours are, right? They know what faculty mean when you're looking for internships and co-ops. They know that there are certain resources available on campus, mental health counseling, but people whose families have no knowledge of these concepts, they're sort of on their own, and they're starting from like the beginning, right? So they don't know necessarily what an office hour is. They don't know that co-ops and internships start through relationships and start by getting to know the faculty members. So, having said that, the real difference I found between first gen and non-first gen is that the first gen students were sort of having to figure this out all by themselves, whereas the non-first gen had more of a support system that they could go to in the event that they were really struggling. And they could say, hey, am I supposed to be running out of meals wipes? Am I supposed to be hungry? Like, so for non-first gen, you can go back to your family and say, was this what it was like when you were in college? But with first gen, they don't know.
So how does gender play a role into this?
So gender is, you know, it has more of an impact than you think it would. What I found in my research is that gender, especially for first gen women, a lot of the backgrounds are patriarchal. And so some of the women that are coming from these patriarchal countries where men are given more privileges, more power, it can kind of discourage women from speaking up and advocating for what they need. The other thing is there's a lot of societal pressure on women sometimes to sort of not take up a bunch of space, to not be loud. And when you are housing and food insecure and you're not finding the help that you need to be, it's helpful to be your own advocate. So I found gender really became an issue in terms of seeking out the supports that they needed as well. And the other thing that I found when I was researching is that some higher ed institutions are very traditional. And so where power is distributed on the campus really falls with more traditional students and sort of leaves first gen, commuters, international students, especially those women, sort of on the sides and to fend for themselves. So especially for women, I found that their social capital, and what I mean by social capital is the amount of change they feel they can have on the world and the impact they can have on the world, was smaller when they came to campus. And if they didn't find the faculty, staff, and peers that really encouraged that, then everything that they were seeking out in resources was a little bit diminished.
So you mentioned a little bit about international students
Yes.
and some of the different demographics that this includes.
Right.
So were most of your, like the women in your study international students, or were most of them like from here?
So actually of the 6 women that I spoke to, only one was a traditional international student, and the others were, they weren't necessarily born in the US, but they were naturalized citizens, but English was not their first language.
Okay, so why do you believe that this is a growing issue, and what are some of the long-term impacts of it?
So I believe this is a growing issue, first because not enough people talk about it. So when I started researching and I was talking about food insecurity, I had to switch to hunger, because people thought food insecurity meant that people were insecure about the amount of food that they had. No, is not what I meant at all. So that was a real clue for me that we needed to start at the very beginning. And so I just started telling people, did you know that 37% of college students are hungry and do not have enough to eat? So that's where we had to start, right? And then even when I approached this topic with some of my colleagues and some of my advisors, there was a little bit like, okay, yep, yep, that makes sense, but how are you going to get people to talk to you? Who's going to talk to you about this? And so it was a lesson to me that there was a long way to go, that I was absolutely heading in the right direction, that there was such a gap, and such a need for this. And so the answer to people talking to me is trust. Trusting that I'm someone who understands, who's been in their shoes. That I will take this story and I will propel it and turn it into more of a conversation. And the second part of the question?
Just some long-lasting impacts on it.
Okay. So, long-lasting impacts. What I've observed is that when students' basic needs aren't being met, there isn't a lot of energy left for their classwork. So one of the impacts is when I don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight and I don't know what I'm going to eat, then classwork becomes secondary. And therefore, some students, their GPAs will go down. If you are a student in college on a scholarship, you're very dependent on a high GPA. If that GPA isn't being met, you may not have your scholarship, therefore you cannot continue at the institution. So that's one of the impacts. The other long-term impact I've seen and heard from my students and staff and faculty and everything is that when you are low on funds, and let it be known that when people ask you if they want to go out, a lot of events in college revolve around food, right? Pizza, donuts, cookies, everything's like going out to eat and it's wonderful. But when your friends ask you if you can go out and you say no, and you don't reveal why, then if you keep saying no enough, they're going to stop asking. And then you won't have that social circle you really need, especially as a first-gen woman. If you don't have that family support, the familial support, you need those peers. So for long-term effects could be retention and persistence, not staying in college or taking even longer to graduate, which then adds to your debt level, not graduating at all, and then having no degree and debt, and then also graduating and then not having that social circle that you need, because when you job hunt, it's all about networking and who you know. So if you don't have that strong core of peers that you graduate with, who are you going to turn to say, am I doing this right? Or can you help me? It isn't there. So there's also a social piece that's missing as well.
Yeah, so going into the administration part a little bit. So as you and I and many college students probably know, it's sometimes very hard to get assistance from the administration system and higher education system.
Right.
So if I were like a first generation student, what is something that I could expect going into a situation like that?
Okay, so a first generation student who's possibly experiencing hunger or homelessness?
Yes.
Okay, right. So what you're going to have to expect is that the staff and the faculty and everybody who works at higher ed is absolutely the student's best interest at heart, number one. Number two, what you can expect when you go in is that it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. So you may get one answer from one person, one answer from another person, and it's up to you to decide where to go from there. The other part you can expect is that you can't just go in and say, I'm hungry or I don't have a place to live, fix it, right? They can only do so much. You also have to be a part of that solution as well. And that's the part being advocacy for yourself and having that self-worth piece. That's really important, and that's where a lot of first-gen women especially lack. That's something that they're really struggling with. So expecting the resources to be not perfect, but good enough, and then expecting that you may have to go above and beyond the higher ed institution. You may have to go to the town that the institution is located in, or the city, or maybe beyond that.
Okay, so you said something interesting. You said a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
Can you just explain that a little bit and ways that colleges and universities maybe can switch that and get like a more inclusive answer for everybody?
Love that. Yes. So again, some colleges, universities, very traditional approach to everything. They have a framework in place for a traditional student who's just graduated from high school, speaks English really well, knows what to expect in college, and okay, great. But as we know from the research and in life in general, first-gen students are the fastest growing population on college campuses. Women are achieving more degrees right now than men, right? You've got commuter students, you've got international students, so the one-size-fits-all approach only works if everybody is sharing the same mental model, which it's clear that they're not. So there are a couple examples. So you take the food pantry poster, and a lot of private colleges don't have food pantries yet, but they will, hopefully. I'm talking about the public colleges that I run into now. When you have a poster and you advertise for the food pantry, when you are talking about inclusivity, you should maybe put more than like Campbell's soup on their poster and more traditionally Americanized name brands. Because if you're a international student, or if you're a first-gen student who's maybe not coming from a totally American background, maybe I don't know where you're from, but you're not sure what Campbell's soup is, right? So you're looking for something that's going to represent a source that could help you. So even just adding, because food pantries now have They have non-perishable items, some of them have perishable, some of them have school supplies, some have feminine products, right? So really starting from the poster, just even the print materials and how you advertise and making that more inclusive would help. The other thing that would help is when you go to apply for a resource like a meal swipe program, which is when you can get help. If you were a commuter student, you can get, for some colleges and universities, not everyone, of course, we're getting there. So you can get free cafeteria meals, and some public universities are having they're piloting a housing pilot program, so you can live on campus for free. So when you go to apply for these resources, also you can get reduced parking waivers. So as it costs $450 to $500 a year to park on campus. If you're a commuter student, that could be an issue. So when you go to apply for these, what you have to know and what would be helpful is there's usually an essay that comes with that says that you have to fill out and tell your whole life story. Not everyone's comfortable doing that, because when you put your issue on paper, it's really hard to tell yourself that it's not happening, right? It's really hard to live in that idea of maybe it's better, right? When you put it in black and white, it's very kind of jarring for some people. So getting rid of that application requirement would go a long way to being more inclusive and thinking about the needs of all student populations.
Yeah, so going into specifics on colleges and universities, so what is the role of higher education systems in this, and are they effective in actually assisting first generation students?
So technically, if you really look at the mission statements of most colleges and universities, it's all about the academics, right? That's what higher ed has been. You come here, we're going to teach you, you leave, you get a job, right? So the idea of helping students with basic needs is more of a, I don't want to say a moral self-interest, but it's definitely something that is starting to come more into the conversation. And where do universities? And that's a great question. And some universities will tell you, and they'll make it quite clear, because you'll see from the resources on their campus. They'll have a food pantry, they'll have the meal swipe program. And if they don't have any of those, they have a whole department dedicated to where you could get help, right? So I think that I definitely have seen more of a revolution and a transformation. Revolution might be too strong of a word, a transformation toward the student as a whole, right? And not just the academics.
Yeah, so how can teachers and professors or even staff at the school become more approachable or make themselves more available for students?
Sure, yeah, that's where it starts, right? Student-facing staff and faculty. They are the face of the institution. So I think what would be helpful is having a statement about basic needs be in the syllabus, rather, if you're just taking one class, kind of incorporating the whole student and that holistic view of the student into your curricula. And that starts department-wide, right? So I think faculty I have known that I have worked with are not waiting for their departments. They're going out and doing it in themselves, right? So they've got information everywhere. They'll bring food into class. One professor would keep snacks in her trunk or in her file cabinet when people come into office hours, right? So there are some faculty that are way ahead. And there are other faculty. What you have to understand about faculty is that they're not only they're teaching, but they're also encouraged to publish an awful lot. So they're teaching 4 to 5 classes, they have lives, and on top of that, they're under tremendous pressure to be doing their own research and publishing. So it's not that they don't care about the students, but their time and their resources are also severely limited, especially these days with COVID and everything else. A lot of professors, they've lost part-time work. The part-time professors that used to come in, they don't have work-study students anymore because work-study students require money to get paid, right? So a lot of these professors who would be able to farm out this work are all of a sudden having to do a lot of this on themselves. So to wrap it up, that part of the question, putting it in the syllabi, being aware, again, I know if you're a professor that has a lecture hall of 200 students might be rather difficult, but being aware when a student stops coming to class, isn't doing their homework, right? Going, maybe an email, simple email saying, hey, is everything okay? You know, showing an interest, and I think that in terms of mental health, that goes a long way as well. So we're not talking about mental health today, but we kind of have to when you talk about basic needs securities, because a lot of students who are suffering from mental health issues, that's how it'll show up. They may not say I'm depressed or I'm anxious or, you know, I don't feel like life is going my way. But what you will see is that they don't care about paying their bills anymore and they end up living in the car, or they're not they don't feel like eating because they're just depressed, right? So again, having that mental health supports in the classroom as well. As far as staff goes, being aware, again, a lot of staff who work in higher ed institutions, I would say the ones that I have met, again, best interested students at heart, absolutely. But their framework is a little bit older, and maybe they've come from a home where basic needs are being met. So they're not necessarily looking for that, and they're maybe not keeping up. So I found in my research that a lot of the work done around basic needs securities is volunteer. So they're doing their full-time job, and then they're also doing this as a volunteer. So it's a labor of love for them. So what I would say is encouraging your staff to be aware of the resources that are on campus. Have the applications changed? Do you not need to write the essay anymore? What are the resources if somebody comes to you and says, I'm homeless? Do you still send them to the shelter? Is that safe to do so, especially for women? Should you, should that be the first place that they go, right? So having the staff, encouraging them that having a growth mindset when it comes to what students are suffering or challenges that they are facing outside of the academic arena would really go a long way.
So transitioning a little bit, not too much, but as you mentioned, mental health isn't the topic of this conversation, but it is a big factor in this. Yes. So have you seen in your research any long-lasting health problems with some of these students?
Absolutely, yeah, unfortunately. So what I find, I interviewed undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral candidates all through my research. And what I found that oftentimes that food insecurity, that it doesn't necessarily go away. It's more like a wave, right? So the 1 year, they're food secure, they're housing secure, everything is great, the grades are up, wonderful. And then I find as they get into the later years, especially when it comes to traditional campus housing, usually after your sophomore year, you're encouraged to either get off campus, right, live off campus, or maybe there's senior housing or whatever. But these days, housing is a little bit overcrowded. So the model has been, okay, we want to get the freshmen and sophomores on campus, we want them to feel encouraged and mattered and connected. And then by the time they're juniors and seniors, they've got their own peer group and they can move off campus. Okay, yeah, I agree. But when you move off campus, now you don't have a meal plan. Now you may be commuting. Now you're done and disconnected from that campus setting, and so maybe you don't know where to go for help.
Yeah, so a lot of this I've noticed, and I know that you have mentioned before, comes down to mattering and how you feel like you are a part of the community. So how does mattering and marginalization impact and drive this issue even further?
Yeah, good point, right? So when I started to do this research, I thought, okay, there are so many colleges and universities with food pantries. There are so many that have meal swipe programs, yet this problem keeps getting worse. So clearly, it's not a surface level solution, right? So you really need to go from a single loop approach to a double loop, meaning that there is more than one way that we can come at this. And for me, and for what I observed and lived and the students and everything, it came down to mattering and marginalization. So when students feel they matter, when they feel connected to the community as a whole, when they see the university going out of their way to promote the programs on social media, to make sure that the food pantry is stocked and open, at some convenient hours, to provide some free parking spaces maybe for commuter students every now and then, or have orientations or programs that really bring non-traditional students, first-gen women, commuters international into the fold, then they're like, okay, I matter, therefore I am capable of doing all of these things, right? It gives them hope, right? It gives them a model to see that, okay, if they're invested in me, I'm going to invest back in them, and it's this beautiful cycle, of trust and a relationship building. So when that's wonderful, and when that all comes together, it's beautiful. But then, unfortunately, when you have marginalization, what happens with, and I'll give an example. So I had a student who she was an international student, she is rather, an international student. English is not her first language. I thought her English was great. She really was having a tough time. She didn't believe that it was as good as it was. So she used this program called Canvas, which is a learning management system. Anyway, she wanted to get help, but everyone spoke English, right? So she was asking her questions. Now, if you can't figure out the university's intranet, which is where the emails come from, the homework comes from, right? You're really kind of sunk. So she went and she finally found, she couldn't find anyone that would speak Spanish. That was her her language. So she was really feeling marginalized because she was like, okay, you bring these international students in, where are the supports, right? I need someone who can communicate to me in my heritage language. Like, there are subtleties, right, that can only be expressed, especially with something this important, like this foundation for the Canvas. That's her whole grad program rests on knowing how to manipulate this, right? So she finally found someone who not only spoke Spanish, was from her area, and so she went from marginalization to mattering in a matter of days, because not only was she able to understand how to manipulate the system, she was also able to help some of her fellow peers who were in the same situation, and so that really circled out and was a success story.
Yeah, so you mentioned a little bit about social media and communication and how that can play a big part.
Yes.
Can you just go into a little bit more how social media plays a role in this and how communication can be iffy?
Absolutely, right? Well, what's the point of having all these resources if they're not well communicated, right? If nobody knows about them, how can they work, right? So I found in my research that email is the fallback and default for all of these private and public universities. And the students just get so many emails. And you know what? They don't care. They don't care about emails. They didn't grow up really tuning into emails. Everything was texting in the phone. Okay, so where it really is, where they need to meet the students where they're at. And this is, again, going back to that inclusivity and that traditional model, right? You don't have the students come to you. You need to go to the students if you're really interested in helping them, right? So I noticed that when I did research for public and private universities, Facebook, if they did have a social media presence, Facebook. Hello, the students aren't looking at Facebook. Facebook is for their parents, right? They're on Facebook maybe, but just because they have to be, but not like they're really invested. So what you really need to do if you want to advertise these, because there are some wonderful resources out there that could really make a difference, but who knows about them? You have to go to where the students are, which my students told me they went to Insta, Snapchat, Twitter, a little bit, okay, but not really a lot. And so what happens is the people in charge of, again, advertising these student resources about meals and food, again, volunteer. Some of them are older. They don't have time to learn the intricacies of Insta or Snap or put the pictures up or tell the stories or whatever's going to get, right? The likes and the hits and all that. So what they really need to do is have a work study student who is a peer. You really need a peer on social media to communicate with your other peers. And that would really go a long way.
Yeah. So actually, that is all the time we have today. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure having you in the studio today.
Thank you. So excited to talk about this topic, and hopefully that it sparks conversations for students, first gen and otherwise, who are getting ready for college or who are already there, that there's hope, that people believe in you, that you matter and you belong in higher ed, and it really is worth it.
Yeah, and thank you so much. Everything that you talked about was very enlightening.
Great.
So thank you to the folks at home as well for tuning into this program. Again, we spoke with Roi Armstrong today, and I'm your host, Martha Constantinides. Stay safe and have a lovely night.